Don got his PhD in audiology at LSU at the Baton Rouge campus, and he's been a vice president of Oticon for 20 years. Yeah, 20 years at Oticon. That's some dedication. So on both Oticon's part and Dr. Shum's part. So why don't you join me in welcoming again Don Shum. Thank you, Don. Thank you.
Yeah, it's one of those, my relationship with Oticon is one of those marriages that just seems to last. So, okay, I don't want to cut Phonex cookie break short, out of respect to the competition, so glad you got your cookies. Okay, let's get started then, because we're going to have to get through this. What I want to talk about is the way noise is being handled in hearing aids these days. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the way that traditionally is handled in hearing aids very briefly, because we've been doing that for a long period of time. I'll talk about some of the newer things that you're seeing these days in the marketplace, and then what I want to do is finish up with one look into the future about something that I think is really interesting. And so although the title is Current Approaches, I thought you'd find it, especially this time of day, interesting to get a little bit of a science fiction sort of view of where we can possibly go. So that's the agenda. So the challenge, of course, the unmet challenge for our patients is speech understanding in complex environments. And I think it's important. I think it's important for us to be honest with ourselves when we come to the development side of the business, and honest with ourselves when it comes to the treatment side of the business, that when patients talk about hearing and noise and having trouble hearing and noise, they're talking about hearing in situations where other people are talking. There's a lot of things that can be done to handle environmental noises, and a lot that's been done in hearing aids over the year to handle environmental noises have been relatively effective. But the greatest unmet need is when patients run into situations where other people are talking, and that continues to be the hard problem to solve. And I'll talk to you a little bit, especially later in the talk, about how we're going after that, especially as we look towards the future. It's important to talk about speech versus noise because that is what we're trying to get rid of. And again, the definition of noise that I'm going to use is whatever the patient doesn't want to listen to at that moment in time. And that's, I think, is the only fair definition of noise when it comes to hearing aids. You can talk about traffic noise, you can talk about fan noise, you can talk about all these things that an engineer can easily get rid of. But when it comes down to the issue of somebody with sensorineural hearing loss who has a very compromised encoding system in the periphery and is sending a very incomplete or distorted message up or signal up to the cortex, and you expect the cortex to be able to do something with that message, it's just a very hard task for someone with sensorineural hearing loss to do that separation of the talker you want to listen to from the talker you don't want to listen to. And that's really what it comes down to. And then the pressure, of course, comes back to the engineers and the signal processing people and the researchers and the hearing aid companies to say, I want you to create a hearing aid that knows what is the interesting person that I want to pay attention to in this crowded room, and what are the boring people that I don't want to pay attention to. And that becomes a little bit of a trick for a hearing aid to know who's boring and who's not boring. But if you think that's a little bit of an overstatement, imagine this situation. If you have normal hearing and you're at the cocktail party tonight, and I get to lecture for you for 45 minutes, but because I was cut short because I sent you on cookie break, I think I have more that I want to tell you. And so you're being polite to me and you're allowing me to kind of continue my lecture to you, and you can smile and nod at all the right times, but there's a great conversation going on over here about the Pac-12 championship or something like that going on, and how easy it is for you, if you have normal hearing, to continue to look at me but actually shift your attention over to this conversation without any acoustic change happening whatsoever. It's simply a cognitive process that you just did, was to take a complex input at one moment in time, pay attention to one strain, of the information coming in, and then the next moment in time, you're paying attention to another part of that complex waveform, even though the waveform itself hasn't changed one bit. And so the issue is if you have normal hearing and a normal cognitive system, that is a really easy thing to do. You can do that pretty effectively. But if you have a compromised peripheral auditory system and the encoded signal that gets sent up to the cortex is lousy, then it becomes much harder for the brain to do anything with it, especially the brain of a person who's getting up there in years and whose cognitive processing just might not be as good as it ever used to be. So we just have to be realistic about what speech and noise means and where the challenge really comes with that. If you want to get rid of noise, you got to find it. That's the simple challenge that we have. If you have a complex input that the person has to listen to, and you want the person to be able to pay attention to part of it and not have to pay attention to another part, so you want to get rid of the noisy part, whatever that is, you got to have some way of isolating out that noise and getting rid of it out of the picture that the person has to listen to. And that simply is not an easy task to do. You have to be able to define it and get rid of it. It can be done, though, right? Noise reduction headsets work within certain parameters. And they work based on a very simple set of assumptions. And if you're not sure how these work, most people do know how they work, but if you're not sure how they work, the reason they work is that what you're interested in is coming up on this cable. So it's coming out of your iPhone or your MP3 player or wherever that signal is coming from. And what you don't want to listen to is all around the head. And so noise reduction headsets work by having a monitoring microphone on the ear cup that is monitoring and capturing all the sound that's in the environment around the person. And this sound is independent of what the person wants to listen to. And that's the key, is that the signal is separated out from the noise. So you can use some very powerful mathematical techniques to get rid of the sound around the person because it is totally independent of the sound that you want the person to listen to. And that's the way they work, and the reason they do work is because you have that independence. The reason why Bose, I used to say the reason Bose doesn't make hearing aids, but that's a little bit of a that's getting to be a dated comment now. But the reason why noise reduction headsets can't work the same way that hearing aids do, or vice versa, the hearing aids can't work the same way that noise reduction headsets work, is because the signal is already mixed or partially mixed by the time it gets to the hearing aid. So the hearing aid developers don't have that luxury of having a separated, isolated signal that they get to deal with. The signal, in most cases, is already mixed, at least to some degree, before they can do the work. So the same principles that Bose and the other headset makers use to get rid of noise are simply not principles that we can use in hearing aids. And so we have to find other principles to find the noise and get rid of it. So that's part of reality. On the positive side, in terms of what we get to work with in terms of principles, sources in environments tend to be localized. Sound comes from somewhere, right? Sound isn't just some sort of in the ether all around you. Sound usually is driven from one point in space. Now, if you have enough reverberation in the environment, basically sound is all around you. But let's assume that you're not in a Gothic church and you're in some sort of moderate sort of listening environment, then there's usually some sort of localization of the sound sources that you're dealing with. So that's one of the things that we have working in our favor. The other thing that's working in our favor are non-speech sound sources don't look like speech to a machine. In other words, you can do a certain amount of analysis. I'll show you what that analysis looks like in a few moments. But speech has some unique characteristics. The waveform of speech has some unique characteristics, and those unique characteristics can be separated out from non-speech signals. So that part is helpful for us as long as what we're trying to get rid of is non-speech. But the waveform of my speech on a long-term basis is going to look very similar to the waveform of anybody else's speech, so that doesn't apply if the competition is another talker. On the negative side, the things we have working against us are that speech may be either good or bad. In other words, I just gave you an example a few moments ago I'll give you another example. Let's say you're sitting around a table at lunch, and you're having a conversation with the person at your left. And so that person's speech at that moment in time is a signal, and all the other conversations in the room are noise, until you decide to turn your attention over to the person sitting over here. Now they're the signal, and they used to be the noise, and this person who used to be the signal is now the noise. And then the waiter comes up, but the waiter's talking down at that end of the table, so he's part of the noise until he comes over to you and asks you for your order, then he's the signal. So speech at any moment in time could be good or bad. It depends on who you're paying attention to. So that's another challenge that we have to deal with. Bad speech looks like good speech to a machine, right? Like I said, the waveform of speech, depending on how you analyze it, for the most part, given the analysis that we've used in the field so far, one person's speech looks pretty much like anybody else's speech. There's some caveats as we look into the future, but for right now, that's what we have. And the third point is that environmental control is noticeable. In other words, there's a lot of things that hearing aid companies do in directionality and noise reduction programs to make them not sound so apparent to the user. As hearing care professionals, we tend to be very focused on improving their speech understanding. And so we'll do whatever we can to improve speech understanding. But the reality is that people wear their hearing aids, hopefully 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's their world of sound. And so users tend to judge hearing aids on a much broader range of dimensions than the hearing care professional might. Sound quality is important to users because that's the world of sound. And so one of the problems with environmentally controlling systems like directionality and noise reduction is that if they become too apparent to a listener or to a user, the user oftentimes will respond negatively to that. So the time window in which noise reduction and directionality traditionally in hearing aids changes has purposely been made relatively long so that the changes become relatively subtle to the user and not so apparent. Users don't like to hear things turning on and off in their hearing aids usually. Sometimes you get a patient who's like, I paid $6,000 for that set of hearing aids. I want to know it's doing something. Sometimes you get that response, but not too often. Usually it bothers a person when they hear their hearing aid doing stuff. And so we have to tune systems and hearing aids so they're not so apparent to the user. So traditional approaches, let me talk about how those work. In adaptive directionality, it's a pretty simple principle. If you're not familiar with it, it's SPL minimization. And what I mean by that is, as you know, with adaptive directionality, you have this polar plot. And the polar plot's changing all the time. Okay? And the job of the polar plot is very simple. Reduce the total SPL that's going in the hearing aid. That's how they work. Okay? And they do that by pointing the null, or the point of least sensitivity, in the direction of the signal that has the highest intensity. But they don't measure the intensity of signals in the room. What it does is it finds out which direction should I be facing in order so that the total SPL in the hearing aid is minimal. And then I must be pointing in the right direction. So it works a little backwards, but it works. Adaptive directionality has been around for 20 years, and when it works fine. Adaptive directionality, if the sound that you're interested in is in front of you, and there is other sound that you're not interested behind you, especially if it's localized, so it's in one particular place, and so you're not dealing with a diffuse noise or a highly reverberant environment, it can find that region where the greatest amount of SPL is coming to the back or side to you and minimize it by, on average about 5 dB or so in terms of, kind of working realities in realistic environments. And so they work. But they start to break down when the sounds that you're trying to get rid of are in the front half of the listening field or if it's a highly reverberant environment. But if you're in an environment where the noise is from in back, the speech is from in front, and it's not too reverberant, then they work. And so it works pretty well. But it's pretty simple principles that drive these systems. But again, having a patient evaluate reverberation is not easy. They can tell where sounds are coming from, but they typically don't walk around with a sound level meter and a spectrum analyzer and can tell you what the reverberation time in an environment. But they can come in and say something like, yeah, you know, I went out to lunch with my wife and I had this new directional system in the hearing aid and it didn't seem to work. Well, where did you go? Well, I went to my favorite Mexican restaurant. Describe the restaurant. Well, there's tiles on the floor, and there's tiles on the table, and there's tiles on the walls, and there's tiles on the ceiling, you know. And then for some reason the directional system doesn't work. Well, surprise, surprise, you know, it's a highly reverberant environment. So that's the only limitation to that. But these systems work, but they work within limits. You can do this, again, as you know, you can do this in multiple frequency regions. So you can have one adaptive polar plot in one frequency region that is operating basically independently in other frequency regions. So theoretically, if you have more than one sound source in the environment and there are different frequency regions, then you can have different polar plots or different directional responses in different frequency regions depending on how the hearing aid is configured. And most modern hearing aids kind of in the mid and high end part of the marketplace have multi-channel or multi-band directional systems operating in them. Noise reduction. Noise reduction is basically a variation of spectral subtraction. And spectral subtraction means a lot of different things to a lot of different engineering type people. But I'll define it very broadly that spectral subtraction is a noise reduction approach that reduces the response in a specific frequency region in order to get rid of a noxious stimuli. You know, and so it is from that viewpoint, it's spectral subtraction. Now, if you get down to mathematical derivation of what spectral subtraction means, that's a different description. But spectral subtraction basically means that you find the frequency region that is dominated by the signal that you want to get rid of, and you subtract it. You just reduce gain in that region. That's something that most hearing care professionals, a lot of hearing care professionals may not know. When you have something called noise reduction as it's deployed in hearing aids, and traditionally been deployed in hearing aids for the last couple decades, it is basically just a change in the frequency response of the hearing aid. In other words, you have a frequency response and it's set up to do a certain thing depending on the audiometric characteristics of the patient. And if you have noise reduction in the hearing aids, basically what ends up happening is there's an analysis being done in each channel of your hearing aid, and I'll show you what that analysis looks like in a second. And it's finding the channels that seem to be dominated by a non-speech signal and reducing the gain in that channel for that time period that it defines that noise is present. And that's all that happens. There's no separation of speech and noise. That doesn't happen. It's just a change in the frequency response. And this is typically when the room gets quiet, like it just did. Like people are like, oh, really? That's what it does? But that's basically what it does. There's no separation. The signal to noise ratio in each channel of the hearing aid does not change. What ends up happening is the channels that are dominated by a clearly defined speech signal remain up at their natural level, and the channels that are defined as having a non-dominant speech signal or noise are reduced. And so that's what noise reduction is in hearing aids traditionally. And there's a lot of fancy terms and a lot of fancy spins and a lot of fancy wrinkles to that different manufacturers use, but fundamentally that's traditionally what noise reduction does in hearing aids. So that's something that is not necessarily well understood by a lot of hearing care professionals. So noise reduction as kind of a variation of spectral subtraction works fine if the signal that you want to get rid of is a narrowband signal. So let's say you have a tea kettle that's whistling, and you have a noise reduction system that can identify that and reduces gain there. Well, the patient doesn't have to listen to the whistle as much anymore. Now, whatever speech was in that frequency region gets reduced also, but the cognitive system is really nice to you because the cognitive system can take an incomplete speech signal and make it sound complete to you. In other words, you don't have to hear the whole speech signal to understand sentences. That's been known for decades. And so if you cut out a relatively narrow chunk of the spectrum and reduce gain there because you're trying to get rid of noise, the rest of the spectrum, you'll still hear the speech and understand it just fine. So you don't miss it as much. In fact, once you get above, if you get about 50% of the speech signal, you can start to understand what's going on. If you get up to about 65 to 70% of the speech signal, you can understand sentences quite fine without too much trouble. In fact, most time in realistic, moderate listening environments, if you have normal hearing, you're only getting probably about 70% of the information in the speech signal is coming through above whatever else is going on in the room, but you put it together without a lot of stress. So that's just the way it works. The problem, of course, with noise reduction is that if you're trying to get rid of something that is broader band than the whistle of a tea kettle, then what you end up doing is you start sacrificing more and more of the spectrum. So if you have up in the upper panel is the long-term average of speech, and let's say the long-term average of some traffic noise, which is a little bit more low-frequency dominated in this case than speech. But if your noise reduction is going to try to deal with that, it's going to reduce a pretty broad part of the frequency spectrum to try to get that noise of the traffic to go away, and it's going to take whatever speech is there and it's going to take it down also. And maybe what's left up in the higher frequencies are enough for you to understand what's going on. But there was no separation at all. It was simply a change in the core frequency response of the hearing aid to get rid of it. So that's what noise reduction traditionally has been in hearing aids. I said that in each channel of the hearing aid, there's going to be a test to decide whether or not that's speech or non-speech. And the test that we use is modulation. Speech is a highly modulated signal. In other words, because of the structure of speech, you have periods of high intensity and periods of low intensity. The high intensity typically are the vowels, especially the stressed vowels, and the lower intensity tend to be the consonants, and they're going to vary in terms of how intense they are, depending on if it's a voiced consonant or an unvoiced consonant. There's also natural gaps in speech. Stops, affricates have closure periods where there's theoretically silence at that moment in time. And so speech is a highly modulated signal. It has ups and downs. And we know how often those ups and downs typically occur. They occur somewhere between 3 and 7 times per second, depending on the speaking rate of the talker. And we know that the peak difference between the most intense phoneme and the least intense phoneme can be 30 dB or greater. And so we know how big the peaks are and how low the valleys are. So we have a mathematical description of what the speech looks like as a waveform. Okay. If you take a look at any non-speech signal, there's no non-speech signals that I know of that modulate like the speech signal, except if it's something that a real ear company created to make it look like a speech signal. But there's nothing that happens in real situations that modulates like the speech signal. So modulation testing is a very good test to differentiate between clearly defined speech and something that's not clearly defined speech. And so that's been used for 2 decades in hearing aids as the test in noise reduction to tell when you should reduce gain or not. So it's been going on. The problem with modulation analysis is that when you embed a highly modulated signal in a signal that's not modulated, what ends up happening is now it's not a highly modulated signal anymore, because whatever wasn't modulating fills in all the valleys. And so now what you have is you have the peaks of the speech signal still coming through, but you don't have the full valley depth. And so it becomes harder mathematically to determine whether that was speech and noise or just noise, because you're not seeing the full depth of the peaks and valleys. You can still see how often the peaks occur, but you can't see how far they're dropping down. So in the bottom panel, what I did is I mixed those 2 signals at the top at 2 different signal-to-noise ratios, and you can see on the left side, it's still pretty easy to identify that as a speech signal, but once you get over to the right side, it starts to become a little bit more unclear about whether or not that's a speech signal or not, based only on modulation. So noise reduction based on modulation analysis has always suffered from being of a big gray area. If it's 25 dB signal to noise ratio, then it's clearly, you can find speech, no problem. If it's 0 dB signal to noise ratio, then it's clearly you're not going to find the speech. Even though a normal hearing person can hear and understand speech, that's that signal to noise ratio based on modulation analysis, you're not going to see enough speech to call it that. But when you get in these signal to noise ratios like +5 and +10 and +15, then it becomes much more gray to the analysis function in the hearing aid, whether that's speech and noise or simply partially modulated noise signal. And so that's where, in each hearing aid company kind of figures out some scheme about how sensitive it's going to be. Am I speech sensitive or I'm comfort sensitive? That's one way you can think about it in a hearing aid. But again, so there's always been these inherent limitations in traditionally the way modulation analysis works. So something to keep in mind. The other big issue with noise reduction and directionality in hearing aids is they tend to be slow response systems. And remember earlier I said that users typically don't like to hear their hearing aids doing stuff. And so because of that, the hearing aid companies typically slow the response of their noise reduction and directionality down pretty high because they can only work so fast. But if they worked as fast as the analysis would allow them to do, they would be kind of right in that sweet spot where people can hear them operating. So if they change every second or two, that's too fast. And so what they tend to do is slow down and make their mode changes much more gradually. So here is an example. This is from one of our hearing aids from our past generation of high-end hearing aids. And in that hearing aid, we have different operational principles where we make the hearing aid more responsive or less responsive to change in the environment. We call them identities or personal profiles. We've used different terms over the years. But the point is that you can kind of set up the sensitivity in these hearing aids to do things. So these are the two extremes in the hearing aid. Steady is the most steady response out of the hearing aid, and lively is a hearing aid that changes about as fast as we feel that we can make a hearing aid change. So this was a speech embedded in noise signal with a lot of noise in it, as you can tell, because you see very little speech modulation. And this was the effect of the hearing aid kicking in. So the red arrow shows you where the directionality kicks in. And then the yellow arrow shows where the noise reduction kicks in. And in most hearing aids, most traditional hearing aids, directionality usually happens before noise reduction. So directionality, because it can be a more direct improvement of the signal-to-noise ratio, that happens first, and then noise reduction kind of does the mop-up. That's normally how it's set up in hearing aids. But what you notice now at the onset of the signal, it takes about 2 seconds before even the directionality kicks in, and another 3 or 4 seconds before noise reduction kicks in, and that's about as fast as we could possibly drive it, because you go much faster than patients just notice it too much. To the point where on some settings, here you're waiting a good maybe 5 or 6 seconds before directionality kicks in, and then another 7, 8, 9 seconds before directionality kicks in, or noise reduction kicks in. And again, these timing patterns are pretty typical of what you see in the marketplace. Most systems work somewhere within this window between those two. And so this is not specific to the way we were driving our system. It's kind of the way these systems work in general. So what you don't see, these operate, a colleague of mine refers to these operating at the speed at which you walk, meaning these systems change as you, for example, walk from room to room. These are not working fast enough that they can track and change noises that are coming and going faster than basically overall changes in a room that you might be listening in. To kind of give you an idea of what they're designed to do is to control the environment that you're in and not each individual sound that occurs in that room. So you get an idea. So that's traditional and some of the limitations that are out there. And so, all the hearing aid companies knew that. They knew that there's limitations that we're dealing with, and so people wanted to come up with better ideas. So there are basically 2 different directions that we saw as new concepts. So somewhere around 5 years ago or so, you start to see a lot of talk in the field about beamforming. Beamforming is a concept that has been around for a lot longer than beamforming has been in hearing aids. Beamforming has been talked about experimentally in hearing aids for decades. It happens all the time in other communication environments. You've seen the guys on the football sidelines with the big parabolas, right? They get wiped out when the wide receiver goes out of bounds. He's the guy who always takes it on the chin because he's pointing with his parabola. But that's a beamforming concept to try to zone in on the quarterback's mouth when they're calling plays. or calling signals. You know, if you're in a stadium with 50,000 or 80,000 screaming fans, and you can hear Peyton Manning screaming Omaha, you know, it's not just because his voice was that loud, it's because they were doing a really good job of beamforming and zeroing in on his voice, you know. So that's just the way those systems are working. But in hearing aids, it couldn't really work until we were able to connect the hearing aids on either side of the head. Because with beamforming, you need some sort of array of microphones. And the 2 microphones on traditional directional hearing aids was not a big enough array. We needed a bigger array. So the idea was if you have 2 hearing aids on either side of the head with 2 microphones on each hearing aid and you can connect them and trade signals back and forth, then you can do beamforming. So the 2 companies in the marketplace who have beamforming, they needed a high-speed data transmission between the ears before they can do it. And once they had a high-speed data transmission between the ears, they could do it. And beamforming works for what it's designed to work for. So what beamforming is designed to do is deal with a situation like this, where there's a person directly in front of you that you're interested in listening to, and then there's other sounds in the environment, maybe other conversations going on in the front half of your listening field. So traditional directionality is not going to solve that problem because traditional directionality takes care of what's going on back here. So with beamforming, the idea is to focus in on that spotlight right in front of you. So beamforming works within that limited condition. As long as you keep, you know, straight ahead and you don't vary your head too much, then it does what it does. It took a while to work out beamforming because there's always some kind of noise artifacts that was with beamforming, but you know, those kind of got hammered out as these systems came online, and it works as far as that goes. But the issue is, at least, and again, this becomes very company specific because we don't do beamforming. One of the reasons we don't do that is that is a little bit of an artificial limitation to place on the patient. That the only way they're going to get relief is if they're looking directly at the person that they're listening to. And so for that person, they get a really nice signal-to-noise ratio improvement. But if they want to listen more broadly to that, if they want to be sensitive to other sounds in the environment or other people talking around them, they don't have that advantage with beamforming. So beamforming is effective, but it's effective in a very specific range and task range. We've done something different, integrated ultrafast directionality and noise reduction. And what we did is what we were trying to do was find some way of replicating this Bose effect of being able to separate out the signal to noise or have some sort of independent look at the signal and noise. And so based on some work that was done by some of our engineers, they came up with a very interesting way of approaching it. And the way our system works, and I'm not going to get deep into the details of it because of time and other reasons, but the way this system has worked is first there is an analysis function. So there's an analysis function of what's going on in the environment, and then that information is shared to both the directionality system, we call it balance, and noise removal. And what makes this analysis function different is that it has an ongoing look at the environment in 2 different ways. One is a 360-degree look at the environment, so basically an omnidirectional look at the environment. And one is a backwards-facing look at the environment. So it uses a directional response where it's only looking at what's going on behind the listener. And then what ends up happening is that mathematically, by comparing these 2 responses, they can find small enough differences between signals that are coming from and back versus the entire sound field to be able to capture and identify sounds that are coming from in front more specifically. And again, the magic is in the math and all the algorithm, and I'm a country audiologist, and so, you know, I can't get into the details about how that actually works. But the idea being, instead of directional systems that only have one adaptive polar plot going on, this system works by having 2 different polar plots going on at the same time, but only part of the analysis. And then it is the separation of the signals that occur that are different between these 2 responses, finding those differences and then capitalizing on those differences, and using that to drive further directional response of the hearing aid, and very importantly, to drive the noise reduction effect of the circuit. And that's it's just a very different way of wiring up a signal. a circuit. So part of the advantages of this system are the way it's wired, but the other advantage of this system is the time speed that it operates in. And these updates to the function happen every 10 milliseconds. So the update speed to traditional directionality noise reduction, like I said, are somewhere in the order of 3 to 10 seconds. Now you're talking about update speeds in 16 channels that occur every 10 milliseconds. So now we're way on the other side of the perceptual time window of when you hear the hearing aid working. And so by dividing it up in the 16 channels and making adjustments every 10 milliseconds based on a more a spatially aware analysis of where sound is coming from, it just allows the system to be a more effective way of reducing sounds in the environment. So it's not these independent directional systems and noise reduction systems, but it's a combined system that allows both of these to happen. I'm not going to go through the data because, on showing how this works, but just in general, it has the ability to update itself much quicker and be a much more effective way of managing sounds in the environment. So it's a different class of noise reduction and directionality. It's operating based on different principles, and very importantly, it's operating on different time windows than we've ever seen in the marketplace. If you want more details about the way our system works, then you should talk to Oticon people specifically, and they can give you more information on that. But it was our attempt to kind of break through the barriers that we've been dealing with for the last 20 years and finding a different way of trying to solve this problem that wasn't beamforming, and we believe that we've been pretty successful in that. Anyway, what I want to do in the last 10 minutes is give you a glimpse into the future so you have an idea of where we're going with this. So again, it gets back to this idea that the biggest challenge is being in an environment with other people talking. And the point is, how does the brain manage in complex environments? And because of that, I'm actually going to give you something to do. And what you're about to hear is you're going to hear a recording of a male and a female, and they're both talking at the same time. And what I want you to do is right now decide if you're going to listen to the male or female and try to follow that person all the way through, okay? So it's going to be a male and a female. It doesn't matter to me who you listen to. Just pick one of them and try to listen through it. It's about a 10-second sound sample.
While I'm in this
drive into
meeting,
work
I
all
need
the
you to
time,
take care of
but I
a
got
couple
tired of
things.
sitting in traffic.
I need you to
At
call
least
the
with the
Atlanta
train, I
office
can
and
get a
have
little
them fax
reading
last
done.
week's sales
It usually
figures.
saves some time.
Also,
if I'm
copy this
lucky,
memo
I can
and
catch an
distribute it to
express
everyone
train
in
and be in the
Marketplace.
office by 8:30.
Were you able to do it? It's hard, but you can do it, right? Well, maybe it's late in the day. But here's the trick. Now what I want you to do is switch. So what I want you to do now, if you listen to the male, now listen to the female and vice versa. Okay? See if you can do that.
While I'm in this
drive into
meeting,
work
I
all
need you
the
to
time,
take care of
but
a
I got
couple
tired of
things.
sitting in traffic.
I need you to
At
call
least
the
with the
Atlanta
train, I
office
can
and
get a
have
little
them fax
reading
last
done.
week's
It
sales
usually
figures.
saves some time.
Also,
if I'm
copy this
lucky,
memo
I can
and
catch an
distribute it to
express
everyone
train
in
and be in the
Marketplace.
office by 8:30.
Were you able to switch? Yeah. Now I want, for those of you who could switch, and if you can, I'm not going to question anything about you, why you can't switch. But for those of you who can switch, imagine what just happened. You had a very complex waveform. Speech is a complex waveform. You had two speech signals, same overall level going on, and you were able to, same bandwidth, same overall level, but on a moment-to-moment basis, they were doing different things. And the first time through, you were able to latch on to one talker and listen to that person all the way through. And then with the exact same complex input, you were able to switch who you listen to and listen all the way through. The brain is a really good thing. Treat it well, because that's what it does for you. That had nothing to do with signal processing. That had nothing to do with anything other than the fact that you have pretty good hearing and you have a relatively moderately functioning brain, in your head, hopefully, and you were able to do that. The point is, can we teach a hearing aid to do that, right? Because you're not going to do it by filtering, because it's the same long-term level. You're not going to do it by noise reduction. You're not going to do it by anything else other than replicating that cognitive process of speaker separation. And that's what one of the futures in hearing aid signal processing is going to be all about, is this sort of speaker separation. What did you pick, what cues did you pick on to decide one speaker's voice from another? Well, if you ask a hearing care professional, especially if you ask an audiologist student, they're going to say, oh, well, fundamental frequency is different in the timbre of the voice, and they'll go through this whole long list that they learned by reading a speech acoustics textbook, okay? All right? The reality is that's probably not the way the brain works. The brain is much more opportunistic than that. The brain will grab anything it can to separate out the voices. And so it could be any of these things that it picked on, except location in this case, because you didn't have location cues, it was a monaural signal that you listened to. And you don't have visual cues unless you're watching me and thinking that I was talking and it wasn't me. So the point is that your brain, and you didn't have to decide what cues you were going to listen to. It was just the sound of a person's voice. You latched onto one voice or latched onto another voice. And it's that latching on that's the key. The human voice is very distinctive. Voice pattern analysis, you've ever seen one of these cop shows where they analyze somebody's voice and they say, oh, I can identify with 95% accuracy that that's such and such voice. That's a reality. And the reason it's reality is that that speech comes from inside the human body. And it's a biometric marker, just like a fingerprint or an iris scan. Speech comes through the cavities of your head, and the inside of everyone's head is shaped a little bit differently. The size of your mouth, the size of your tongue, the size of your velum, all those are changed a little bit differently. So the resonant characteristics of these holes in your head are specific to you as a human. And that's what drives a lot of what speech separates one voice from another. Other things do, rate and other things, but one of the things is the sound of the voice. So what you're going to see now that we're getting more and more computer power built into hearing aids and smartphones, because if you haven't realized by now, the next phase of hearing aid development is going to be very dependent on the patient having a smartphone on their body. Because once we can communicate information down to a smartphone, we have that much more computing power to use. And so one of the reasons, right now it's apps to change programs and change volume. But one of the things that we as an industry are counting on is that people are going to have smartphones on their bodies, or nearby somewhere. And that's a great thing to help improve the function of hearing aids because it gives us that much more computing power to be able to use. So it's part of what's going to be the reality in the future. As long as we make it useful, people will wear it. And you might start, oh, my grandmother doesn't use a smartphone. She will if her hearing aids work better. It's not that big of a jump to imagine that she will. And then she can play bingo or whatever she plays on it, at the same time. But one of the things you can see, when I showed you this list, this is kind of the outside looking in way of separating out two voices, saying, oh, I'm going to base it on this or that. The inside out viewpoint is something called deep neural networks, where you basically don't put any restrictions on the voice separation. You let the computer do the work. The computer figures out what the differences are. And you may or may not put limitations on what the computer should be looking at. But in kind of like the purest form of deep neural networks, you don't put any limitations on that. You allow the machine to figure out where the differences are, just like your brain figures out where the differences are between two voices. And we are getting to the point with computer power with hearing aids that deep neural networks as a way of doing speaker separation are not that far off as a reality. We're talking about a horizon of 5 to 10 years in terms of what the future could look like in this area. And it's because the computer power is getting big enough to be able to do that. So the nice thing about the future is it's addressing that one area that traditional noise reduction and directionality can't do a really good job of, is speaker separation. We can do it if they're standing in two different places. But as they get closer together, or as you're talking about a situation where there's no localization cues and you have more than one voice coming together, the cognitive system can tear apart one voice from another. And we're getting closer and closer and closer to the point where hearing aids are going to be able to do that also. So there's a lot of really interesting work being done in the research labs these days on speaker separation based on some of these principles. So anyway, just a little bit of a look into the future. Hopefully, there's a few nuggets or so you picked up along the way. And I know we're running just a little bit close to the time, but I suppose there's time for a few questions. But I'll let Mark make that decision.
Yeah, sure. We got time for one, and then we're going to move on.
Okay.
When are you going to do something other than iPhones? iPhones and Androids, is that a future?
Absolutely. And again, all the companies are dealing with this issue with Androids. The nice thing about iPhones is that there's one operating system. You know, with Androids, there's literally 100 operating systems, and everyone's struggling with that. You know, to try to get that to work better. The other issue is that Android doesn't recognize the Bluetooth Low Energy format, so they use classic Bluetooth. So then there's also limitations about how you can get to that also. But the Bluetooth Low Energy is going to be updated in the industry so that Androids will also be on a newer version of that probably in a year or two. And so you're going to see some movement in that area. But it's Androids, it is the Android operating systems that are really causing all the manufacturers some deal of headaches.
Thank you, Don. Thanks.
And you got